Go ahead and. Of course, our in-class activity last week was I asked you guys.
Oh no, I forgot about that.
Right, haikus. So those of you that were not here, I'll let you try to guess what the topic was last Thursday. If you've not yet looked at this. Okay. Thank you for the home. Now I have a nice sponge dome, forever yours. I take without care. You are constantly in pain. I will soon kill you. That one had some overtones. Okay. And then finally, macro parasites, large and big, like fleas or ticks. Ooh, ooh, parasites. Parasites. So if you were here last Thursday, turn to your neighbor and tell them about the two types of interactions that we talked about last Thursday. And you can explain them, give them the name, and give them a definition. Then we're going to continue talking. See if I can get the wonderful video to
Symbiosis. So like parasitism, penicillin,
Wow, here, you can say so. So yeah, like all parasites and all that, and doing stuff. We talked about that. I'm just trying to think of what we actually talked about.
The term?
Parasite, like it's taking good for one, bad for another. Mutualism, good for both.
Oh,
Then
that.
commensalism, good for one, doesn't really affect the others.
No, we want that in biology.
Yeah, well, we went more in depth, I guess.
Okay, so what was our topic last Thursday? We talked about parasites. Yeah. So what is a parasitic relationship?
positive, negative.
Good. And who benefits?
The parasite,
The parasite. Who doesn't?
the host.
The host. So there are different categories, there can be different relationships. And then in what might be considered a good parasite host relationship, sometimes those relationships turn into what?
Mutualism,
Mutualistic relationships. And how do we define a mutualistic relationship?
positive for both.
Yeah, that both species get some benefit. And we'll start to talk about some of the different ways that we can categorize parasites, or maybe with a variety of different ones. And we'll expand upon that today, looking at kind of different functional categories of mutualism and give you some examples as we start to work our way towards communities. And I kind of came to the realization this morning that I can cram a whole bunch into the end of the semester, or we can cover a few topics really well. And I'm kind of in the few topics really well folks today. We're kind of like to step back and make sure that we have a full and complete discussion about some things really well before we like try to talk about 5 different biogeochemical cycles, which is important, don't get me wrong. But having 10 minutes to talk about each of them will not do them justice. It means that we won't get to talk about other really fun stuff too. This is the predation video that I mentioned that I wanted to show you, so we'll take a look at that. The sound does not play over the system for the classroom, but you may hear it. I think.
This amphibian is a master of disguise. It can hide in plain sight. Suddenly it bolts. The sudden movement has given away the game. Bursts of speed versus relentless stalking. This toad's legs are about half its body length. Powerful thigh muscles act like springs, releasing bursts of energy that enables the toad to hop and even run at top speed. Finally, it reaches the water. Cobras can't swim, can they? It's a faster than they need to be. But the toad is cornered by a completely different predator. In the shadowy underworld of the tropical rainforest, if the cobra can catch you, the African bullfrog probably will.
That's what I really need to see. It's eaten by another frog, which I actually think is cool.
Pretty cool. Can the cobra not eat that other frog?
It could, probably could. African bullfrogs, a bit like our bullfrogs that we have here, they're actually quite large.
Like the swallow.
Yeah, and so even for a big cobra to take on that organism is pretty intense. And the big bullfrog, that they do the same, like these are the physical, traits that make it an excellent predator or escaper, thing. Necessarily. The African bullfrogs, they actually have like little fangs on their jaws and quite powerful jaws, which is what lets them take these bigger prey like other frogs and toads. And so it's actually kind of a formidable competitor almost for the cobra snake. And that the snake is likely to get injured as it's trying to take the toad. The claws on its feet and stuff like it. So it's not, it's like, you ate my dinner, now I'm going to eat you. Probably not. I'm going to find another dinner that's a little bit easier. And again, that's the kind of trade-off that we're constantly talking about with these types of things, and that we'll learn to look at them energetically in terms of calories and this organism an endotherm or an ectotherm, and what is its hunting style and how does that relate together. But they do this subconsciously. And again, like we can put numbers and kind of quantify it with science, but these instinctive subconscious decisions then are really interesting to see how they're driven by something that we can quantify sometimes with metabolomics or with, hunting styles. But it's always great to see another amphibian even. Okay, but today, we are going to continue our discussion about mutualism, and we hopefully will get into some work today about communities as well. Again, because the relationships that build mutualistic relationships, these tight interactions between organisms, become one of these foundational community links between organisms. But these things that we've been talking about, competition, predation, symbioses in their different forms, are these interlinkages between organisms that are the basis of ecology, of what ecologists are studying. And so the culmination of all of that work then is to put these organisms together, not just in their relationships, one species eating another or benefiting another, but then what is the broader picture context? And that's where the community perspective comes in. And so we'll be in chapters kind of like 16, 17, 18, 20 here at the end of the semester, as we start to talk about communities and different ways to describe communities, some of which we've already done actually in lab. And then what are the different kind of ecological theories that come out of that about how communities are organized and structured. Okay. So after we talk about mutualism, we'll start talking about community composition. Hopefully today we'll get to start into discussing species richness and evenness and species dominance, in that the first way that we characterize a community is by counting species, is by identifying them. And that's why we spent a lot of time talking about populations and species already, because that work feeds directly into community ecology. And then we'll see how communities vary over time and space, and I'll probably, that'll round out the end of this semester probably, considering that we have, I think, 5 classes left, including today. I think, yeah, not too many. Okay. All right, so mutualism, as we correctly defined here at the beginning of class, mutualism is interaction between species that is beneficial to both. And we have this very tight relationship between the organisms. They can vary a lot in the type of relationship and how we want to define this relationship. We're going to focus today on these benefits to partners and these different categories that we see in terms of functionality of these organisms and the different services that they're providing to each other. But again, your degree of dependency, if you're totally dependent on each other, one of you is totally dependent, the other has a bunch of different partners, it can really vary, and there's a range then that lead into each other, just as we've seen with lots of stuff this semester. Again, the same thing with the degree of specificity. Are you tied to one species that you interact with, or do you have a whole bunch of pollinators, essentially, that you're working with, and the duration of the relationship. How long are these two organisms together? Is it their whole lives in terms of a lichen? Is it a portion of the life cycle of each of them? Does anybody remember the symbiosis, the mutualism between that the squid here has?
Yes. Phospholuminescence or something from the bacteria.
Yeah, it has bioluminescent bacteria
Yeah,
that
that's
it
what-
cultivates, and then that helps it both in terms of predator defense as well as finding prey items, and may even be involved in their kind of mating behavior. But it's the bobtail squid and these bacteria that live in it and provide its bioluminescence. And of course, the squid has a whole range of camouflage and photophore abilities with its normal skin tone, but this adds just another layer. Okay, all right. So in these benefits to partners, we laid out at the end of class on Thursday that there were these three kind of different categories of mutualistic relationships that, again, functional wise, we could define. And we'll talk about some examples of each of these. The trophic mutualism, where both individuals get a resource out of the process, and most often these are nutritional resources. They're providing food or energy, either one for the other, or they both get some nutritional resource out of the relationship. And again, that trophic, we're going to hear over and over again in terms of trophic pyramids and food web interactions as we start to talk about communities. Defensive mutualism, you tend to get a service for a resource. One gets habitat or shelter from the other, and then you might provide something like a protection bracket in order for that either nutritional resource or habitat sheltering one. And a little bit what's happening here with the shrimp and the glass sponge that they're in is that, again, the shrimp kind of helps to clean the sponge and keep things from growing on it. And at the same time, then the glass sponge provides both shelter and habitat as well as filter feeding food resource to the shrimp that's inside. As we mentioned on Thursday, it's really interesting. The shrimp get in the sponge as larvae, and then as the sponge grows, it grows over the top, and as they get too big to leave, the shrimp do, and so they end up becoming permanent residents of the inside of the sponge as they grow and produce over time. Hey, you don't want to live anywhere else, so it's not a big deal that you're trapped. And that's what Indy's haiku is about.
That's crazy though. Like, I mean, what happens if you don't get another shrimp in the sponge with you or something? You just
Almost all these
lay eggs
guys
somewhere?
are, they're broadcast spawners, so they can release their eggs and sperm, and they'll get carried away by the water currents anyways. And so it's okay if like you don't get paired with a shrimp of the same of the different sex, or you even get another shrimp in there.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely interesting in that would a shrimp that lives there like clean off eggs that have settled and that are going to be like incubating into the larval forms of the shrimp? Like, would they see that as a competitor and they would clean off those eggs and get rid of them, or would they be like, "Yay, a friend," and like grow the eggs? Those are interesting.
Can they survive outside of the sponge?
Yeah, they can. It's not a dependent relationship for either species, but it definitely helps both the sponge and the shrimp to be in this interaction. And then the last one we'll talk about today are dispersive mutualism, where there's like a service that's provided. Pollination is definitely on the range of this, but again, pollination services, the flower is definitely getting a service in terms of distribution of pollen, and in some cases removal of pests that are on the flowers and the plants. And then it really depends on how we want to classify what the pollinator is getting back from the plant. Is that a nutritional, and this is leading into trophic mutualism, or is it a service and that they're getting nectar that then they're going to, again, store or feed or build something with? It just depends. But definitely some services we see are reduced competition, where they are cleaning out competing organisms, or they are helping a plant to have the best ability to get resources in an environment, or enhanced reproduction. And again, as in the case of the pollination, when they're responsible for spreading the sperm from one flower plant to the next. Okay, so we'll talk about some different examples of these. Again, I was like, oh, we didn't get to it Thursday, and we'll move on Tuesday. And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, it's fun to talk about the specifics. I think it'll be more. Okay, So trophic mutualism, we're going to talk about 3 or 4 examples here. And again, trophic is where there's some type of resource service relationship, and usually the resource that is gotten by one of the organisms is nutrition or a food resource. So we ourselves are examples of this type of mutualistic relationship. We have digestive endosymbionts. We have bacteria that live in our gut. We provide them a habitat and food resource, and in return, they help us digest our food. Okay? Like a bunch of the stuff we eat would just pass through us and not be nearly as nutritionally beneficial without these microorganisms chewing on it first and helping us break it down. And your digestive endosymbionts will change in terms of the species composition in relation to the types of food that you eat. And they change naturally over the course of your life, most particularly when you go from being a milk-feeding infant to a solid food chewing toddler-esque person. Okay, and that those types of microorganisms that do best digesting lactose and liquid foods are not the ones that do best when you start to eat solid foods. And so you have a shift that normally happens in your digestive system at this time in your life. How it shifts, how quickly it shifts, what you get in there at the end really depends. But there are lots of organisms that utilize digestive endosymbionts, not just us. And so your endosymbionts are this community that helps you digest food. In the case of most of them that we see, particularly in large herbivore grazing organisms like our ruminant cows, deer, antelope, sheep, those microorganisms that live in their gut help them digest cellulose, which is the dominant storage carbohydrate for plants. And on your own, most mammals can't digest a lot of cellulose, if at all. And so you must have these microorganisms associated with your gut in order to do that. And for lots of these guys, it takes them a couple times through their digestive system in order to actually get all the cellulose calories as well as building blocks out of it. And that's why you have this cud chewing behavior that happens in these different stomachs that have different microorganisms, different muscle action in order to do this digestion. One of the most interesting of these relationships perhaps are the digestive endosymbionts that live in the giant tube worms around hydrothermal vents. So we see similar digestive endosymbionts in the big clams and mollusks that we see around both the hydrothermal vents as well as cold methane seeps that we have at the deep portions of the Caribbean Ocean. And in these locations, the microorganisms that live in their gut sac, which is known as a trophosome, they've completely lost their digestive system in and of themselves, are bacteria that can sulfur oxidize. They can take metal compounds out of this hot, metal-rich environment and turn it into being able to fix carbon out of the water. And then thus they produce food for themselves, and then the excess goes to the tube worm. And the tube worm then provides this wonderful little place where you are safe from things that might filter you out and eat you as bacteria from the water. And then it will constantly give the organism all of the water and oxygen and sulfur and carbon dioxide that it needs in order to feed both of them. It's a really, really tight mutualistic relationship, that it's pretty cool. We've learned by studying these guys that the larval forms of these worms get colonized by these types of endosymbiotic bacteria when they go to start actually building their tubes that they're going to live in as adult organisms. And that as hydrothermal vent fields open up across the ocean floor, they're sequentially colonized by different types of organisms as the larvae and the bacteria float in from nearby hydrothermal vent fields. It's pretty cool. All right, termites are another excellent example of this. They have particular protists that live in their hindgut that let them digest wood, essentially, which is why they can eat wood and other types of insects can't. Cool, all right. In plants, we see lots of relationships between plants and bacteria and other types of organisms in order to help them not necessarily get carbon energy producing things, because of course plants are primary producers themselves, but in order to help them get either water or nutrients out of their environment, particularly out of the soil environment. And so we see some really tight mutualistic relationships between plants and different types of organisms that live in association with their roots. And perhaps the ones that are most important to us as humans are the rhizobial interactions that happen at the root level between different types of soil bacteria and the root hairs and of different types of plants. And this helps the plants be able to either assimilate and take up nitrogen, or actually the bacteria are housed in little pouches or in the tissue of the plant where they themselves will fix nitrogen. And this is absolutely critical for the plants in order to be able to get enough nitrogen in order to be able to live in these environments. And for us agriculturally, we put these types of plants that have these root-associated nitrogen-fixing bacteria in our crop rotation so that we can enhance nitrogen availability in soils, both when these types of plants are growing and then for successive years when we grow plants that don't participate in these types of mutualistic relationships. We have to apply less fertilizer those years because these nitrogen-fixing bacteria were present along with these plants. So these rhizobia are nitrogen-fixing bacteria that associate with plant roots, and they tend to form these little root nodules. There are a couple different ways that they can interact with the plant tissue, but these bacteria normally live free living in the soil, and the plant sends out particular compounds that recruit these bacteria to come and actually invade their tissue, and then the cells of the root hairs will start to specialize to provide them a special little home. And so the bacterium gets shelter, it gets nutrients, it gets carbon that the plant is producing, and in return, the plant gets fixed nitrogen that it can doesn't have to get from the soil. It doesn't have to make as much roots as long as these bacteria are associated. What's also pretty interesting is that for lots of these bacterial species that will form these types of interactions, they don't fix nitrogen when they're free living. It's only when they're in this association with the plant that those particular genes get expressed. And again, that's a really interesting mutualistic relationship for the benefit of these two guys. And then it has this huge ecosystem impact in terms of fixing nitrogen and essentially starting the nitrogen cycle in lots of different locations. Has anybody done any root nodule work? The lab next to mine when I was doing my PhD, like this is their bread and butter. It's like, what is the bacterium root nodule relationship? And they like, you know, you have like grad school presentations and so I've heard a lot, which is good because I didn't know anything about this. Okay, all right. It's not just bacterium that can associate with plants. We also see that there are fungal plant associations that take place. Remember, fungi are these heterotrophic organisms that like excrete digestive enzymes, and then they absorb what they have digested from the environment around them. We eat stuff, and then our digestive enzymes do it, and we absorb it from our like gut cavities as animals. But essentially, a fungus is like an animal that does this on the outside. They don't have bones or spines. Like, there's a whole bunch of differences. But on a trophic level, like that's the only difference between us and fungi. What we see is that, again, there can be these relationships between fungi and most particularly the roots of different plants. And the fungi help to spread out the surface area of the plant so that there's more ability for it to take up nitrogen and phosphorus. And in return, some of their tissues, particularly their hyphae, will receive shelter from the plant. They actually grow into very close association with the plant roots. And again, there can be ones where they actually invade the cell tissue of the plant, and there are ones that just grow in between the cells of the plant, like this guy. And they get carbon from the plant. Again, the excess photosynthate, the plant will feed to the fungi in return for getting nutrients from the fungal uptake underground. We see that 80% of plants have some type of mycorrhizal interaction at the root level with the fungus for this purpose. And they are absolutely critical to decomposition and nutrient cycling, and that these fungi are decomposers that then directly feed those recycled nutrients back into primary producers. And they help to keep the system running very smoothly, as well as enhancing decomposition and removal of waste material. It's an immediate benefit to the plants that grow in that ecosystem. So it's pretty cool. Lots of times, particularly in our region, when you dig into the soil, you'll see all of this white, silvery, thread-like material. And my first reaction is always, oh my gosh, there's a spider living underground. Ah. It's almost always these types of mycorrhizal fungi that have these extensions that are paired with the plants that are growing right next to them. It's pretty amazing. We see that both for the fungi and particularly for trees, that there is, again, a chemical interdependence between these species, and that damage to one can be transmitted throughout the forest ecosystem through this release and uptake of signal compounds between neighboring trees and their interconnection to essentially the same fungal organism, sometimes over tens of acres of land area. Pretty cool. Okay. All right, a couple examples of defensive mutualisms. Again, defense, you're usually getting a service in return for a resource. And lots of times that service is, again, protection from competitors or predators for one of the organisms. And so ants and acacia trees, which you may have talked about already in class, is a great example of mutualism, and usually one of, again, the textbook examples of a mutualistic relationship. The acacia tree provides shelter and nutrition to the ants. When ants are present, the acacia tree will grow these little pouches at the base of its spines that are perfect little nesting sites for the ants. And then the ants will preferentially protect their host tree from grazers. When a grazer comes over to nibble on the leaves, they'll bite and sting and drive the grazer off. And then they'll also pick out all of the vegetation that grows in an area around the acacia tree in order to feed themselves with that vegetation. And then in doing so, they reduce competition for the acacia tree for moisture, nutrients in the soil, and then sunlight, of course, that's coming, which is pretty profound. Here, kind of both organisms are getting some amount of protection in terms of shelter and food for the ant, and then protection for the tree from competitors and herbivores on the other side. And it's helpful in a nutrition aspect too, in that removing competitors for the tree gains access to nutrients in a variety of different ways for them. Cool. All right. This is data actually that shows that the presence of ants help in the case of the acacia tree. We're looking at kind of herbivory level of leaves at the top of the tree and bottom leaves. When there are no ants present, are these kind of open circles, and then of course we can see that herbivory with ants present is less, and so they're doing their job of fighting off herbivores. Again, most especially in the top leaves. It's a less of an effect in the bottom portion of the plant. And then we also see again that the leaves are last longer in the control experiment here when the ants are present. The tree is able to hang on to their leaves longer when ants are there than when we remove the ants or when there aren't any ants on the tree at all. So again, it's a measure of herbivory, and that the longer the leaf is on the tree, obviously it hasn't been eaten by a herbivore. And so the presence of ants actually really does act as a protection for the plant. Okay, cool. All right. One that we talked about last Thursday was this idea of a defensive mutualism, and we see all the time these relationships between organisms where one is a cleaner who's taking off parasites or pests or small predators of an organism, and they get a food resource, nutrition from that, and the other organism then gets clean of its parasite load, gets a reduction of disease, gets this service out of the pest removal system. And so we see this in things like our cleaner shrimp and fish that are associated with just a wide variety of aquatic organisms, both plants as well as animals that they'll clean. And then of course there are all kinds of birds and even some types of lizards that will help to clean fish and mammals that occur in their same ecosystem. And lots of times there are cleaning stations that the larger organism that needs to be cleaned will come to, and they will wait very patiently for the cleaner organism to come and pick off all of their parasites. Lots of times these are somewhat large predatory animals that will act very friendly towards what is normally a prey item at these types of cleaning stations. There's all kinds of neat internet videos about sea turtles coming to this one particular coral head in order for the cleaner fish population to come out and clean them of algae. You see these big giant moa sunfish that swim up next to the reef in order for these organisms to come out and clean them. You see sharks that will just kind of lay there in the seagrass bed while these different crabs and stuff climb all over them. You have sea lions, I think I watched this last week, that are lying on the Galapagos beaches, and these little lizards climb all over. They're like eyeballs eating flies. And the sea lion is like, thanks. And the little lizard is like, yum. Okay, but it was, again, like organisms that you don't normally see interacting, or you see kind of odd behavior. Sometimes it underlies one of these mutualistic relationships that, again, can be very fleeting, but then there's an evolutionary advantage to those species. And again, it's pretty obvious what the benefits to both organisms are, particularly for organisms that have a high parasite load or have a wound that needs cleaning. This type of cleaning really can enhance their future reproductive and survival to have access to these types of cleaners. All right. And again, here we're looking at some actual data about cleaner organisms and the things that they actually clean. They took 5 reefs. Each of these bars is a different reef, little micro ecosystem they probably fenced off in some manner. On 3 of them, they removed the cleaner fish and excluded them from the coral reef habitat. And on 2 of them, the lighter colored ones, they left the cleaner fish there. And then they looked at how many parasites occurred on the fish on these different reefs that either had cleaner fish or did not have cleaner fish. And they saw in their long-term experiment that there were more parasites on the reefs that did not have cleaner fish than on the reefs where there were cleaner fish. The fish had fewer ectoparasites on the outside of them. And in the long-term relationship, this was a significant difference in terms of parasite load. Short-term wise, in a couple of weeks versus a few months, we didn't see a significant impact yet. Like, it took a while, again, for kind of parasite load to develop. Again, if you just kind of take the short term and you added like 12 hours more daylight, you would get that long-term relationship here. Even though it takes a while for this to develop, it just took like another 12 hours of their experiment before they started to see a significant effect, which again indicates that these organisms are visiting the cleaner shrimp relatively frequently in order to get cleaned, and it doesn't actually take long to get a lot of parasites. Cool. Maybe not for full. All right. My last example of a defensive mutualism is this pretty interesting one between corals and crabs. And these are herbivorous crabs that eat these fast-growing algae and seaweeds. And so when the crabs are present, they will clean the coral head of these types of algae. And this allows the coral cnidarian then to stay clean and to be able to grow. But if the crab is not present, they'll get overgrown by the much faster growing algae and little tiny microkelps. And so in this experiment, they did something similar to what we saw in the last one, where they either had cleaning crabs on the corals or they took away the cleaner crabs and looked to see what happened. Okay. They found that the coral thrives when the crabs are present, the coral then also provides shelter to the crabs from predation. So coral growth is over here. When the crab was not there, they hardly grew at all. They grew a lot better when the crab was present. Coral mortality was much higher. They didn't have a cleaner crab, much lower when the crab could help them out with the algae load. And then we looked at predation on crabs, and we found that when the crabs could hide in the coral, fewer of them got eaten by their predators. And when there wasn't any coral to hide in, more of the crabs got eaten. And so again, there is a return relationship here in that the crabs get shelter and habitat, and the coral gets cleaned of its competitors in return. And so it does do that plus-plus relationship, because it's easy to think like, what does the crab get out of this? Well, it gets food, but like it actually gets shelter and habitat. Oh, all right. The last class of mutualism is what we call dispersive mutualism. And again, this is when you get like a service-service relationship lots of times. Sometimes it is service, resource, and nutrition in its relationship for tropism as well. But that can be pretty interesting. Okay, so pollination is the classic example of a dispersive mutualism. So turn to your neighbor. What does each partner get out of a pollination interaction? What does the pollinator get? What does the pollinated plant get?
Alrighty.
Honey.
The,
The plant gets pollinated.
it's the reproductive benefit and the pollinator gets food.
Yeah.
Dispersal.
Okay, what are the benefits?
Food and reproduction.
The pollinators get food.
Yes, you got it. What is the,
Spread their genes.
I think it's spread their genes, right? Like we talked about. Okay. Again, the degree of mutualism and pollination can be very variable, and that in some instances we have a very specialist interaction where the pollinator is engaging with one or just a couple of species of pollinators, and they have this very tight coevolution between them in form as well as function, and that they're setting up their flowers so that only a few species can access them. And this helps them to ensure that this species of pollinator is only going to visit other flowers of the same species. So they get really good insurance that their genes are going to be spread to another plant that can actually use those genes, and not just to another plant and totally different species. Doesn't matter if you dragged your sperm over here or not. In return, then, this individual is going to get a really high reward because there's only a few organisms that can access that reward. Like you can guarantee that you're going to go and there's going to be nectar or honey, whatever is in that location. Not honey, because that's made by bees. There'll be nectar or sugar resource or pollen, fruit to eat there because only you can get to it. Sometimes it's really generalist, and there are bee species that only service and pollinate single types of flowers, but lots of our bee species pollinators will visit a wide range of different species. And so again, that's a more generalist versus a specialist interaction. And again, there's a cost benefit for attracting certain pollinators. You have to put a lot of energy in here and looking like a female wasp to attract the male wasp to come, okay? Like that also limits you in terms of your potential pollinators. And so you have to balance that limitation versus the really high reward that if somebody comes, they're going to take your pollen right on to the next plant that you need. Are you willing to take that risk that maybe no one comes in return for the fact that you will end up getting pollinated as a result if someone comes? Or are you going to be like, everybody can come, it's a buffet, enjoy yourself, I got a couple different things to offer you, but maybe I don't actually get anything in return. All right. The other classic type of dispersive mutualism is seed dispersal, where again, we have a plant usually that is producing a food item, okay? And so the benefit here is that the dispersing organism, whether it's an insect or a bird or a mammal, gets food, nutrition out of it. And in return, the plant gets its seeds distributed. Its already fertilized embryos are then spread across the environment. And so it hopes that they'll encounter a place that is appropriate for them to grow in. And then by being dispersed, they're not going to be in direct competition with one another when they start to germinate, nor will they be in direct competition with the parent plant because they have been moved away. And again, we see specialist, generalist relationships in these types of organisms. Lots of different plants will have brightly colored fruits and berries that are chock full of seeds that a variety of different organisms will eat and then disperse around the seeds in the environment, versus this type of very specialist interaction, where in this case the plant is producing a seed that has a very particular portion of it that is aimed at just feeding this one type of ant species. And the ants preferentially go to this plant because they know they can get the best, most high quality food for themselves and their larvae here. And in doing so, they end up dispersing the seed portion of the fruit that they're getting. And so that's extremely specialized. And it will only work if both the ant and the plant are present in that ecosystem. Otherwise, it breaks down. Whereas this more generalist relationship is going to work for both and all types of species involved. And again, there's different ways that we can go about this dispersal. We tend to think about seeds and being consumed and then being passed through the digestive tract and being spread in feces, which is really beneficial to the seed because they usually land in a nutrient-laden environment that is ready for them to grow in. But there are lots of plants that use this idea of dispersal in a more general category, in that they have burrs or barbs on their seed pods that stick in animal fur or on feathers. We all experienced this semester as we were taking different hikes. And that doesn't require eating or digestion of the seeds by the disperser. They just have to be picked up and brushed by and then brushed off in another location. So again, the degree of intimacy can really vary in these types of relationships. There are a few types of seeds and plants that have to pass through the digestive system of an organism in order to germinate. That by passing through the digestive system, the stomach acid of the disperser removes a critical portion of their seed coat that then allows the seed to germinate when it falls. And that they won't germinate unless and until they've had that type of acid scoring happen on the outside of their shell. Which is also really cool. And of course, the most expensive coffee beans in the world are those that you can buy from this South American small mammal that eats the coffee and then poops out the coffee beans. You get an extra added flavor. I've not had them. I don't think I want to.
Yeah, I watched that little video on that. That was weird.
Yeah.
They literally go around with like a little bag and hunt for the same with food.
Yep. I'm like, if
And
that's,
then pick out the seeds.
yeah, I'm like, if that's your thing.
Yeah. You make money doing it? You like it? Go ahead.
All right. With all the interactions that we've talked about are very direct interactions where we can measure and quantify some type of benefit or harm in the case of parasitism to one or both species that happens here. But sometimes these relationships can be very indirect, and dispersive mutualism is approaching that very indirect relationship, and that particularly with our barbed and burr seeds that are getting dispersed, that's almost like a commensalism relationship. There's no benefit to the disperser to that. They just carry them around. And so the interaction can be very indirect rather than these direct relationships that we've been talking about. And sometimes in examining relationships between organisms and communities, we find very interesting and perhaps hard to observe relationships than we would anticipate. You know, feeding relationships and interactions, true symbioses and mutualisms are fairly direct and straightforward. But sometimes the web is quite complex and things happen that you wouldn't anticipate. And this is where, again, community ecology starts to really bear fruit in understanding the interactions between organisms and how different organisms are structured and occur in different places. Okay, so we have sloths, and you can see these wonderful organisms at the Cincinnati Zoo. They're usually hanging out in one of their large educational areas. The sloth fur grows algae. Okay, they're slow. They live in an extremely humid environment. It's a great place for the algae to grow. And in the sloth fur is not only the algae, but the sloth moth, this little insect. And it turns out that these three very disparate organisms have a very tight mutualistic relationship with each other. The benefit to the sloth is that the moths will eat the algae and reduce the amount of algae on the sloth, which I guess could help you in some way or another. Like, it is your personal cleaning insect. The moth, in return for being carried around by the sloth and eating the algae, gets to have a habitat where it lives and a nursery for its little larvae and its eggs. Okay, so it spends its whole life on the sloth eating the algae. And that removal of algae has a little bit of benefit to the sloth. The sloth will eat its own algae. Okay, like that's a carrying food source that it has on its own back, which is a little bit interesting. And in return for sometimes getting eaten, the algae gets, again, a habitat where it lives, and the dead and dying moths and their feces help to feed and grow the algae that feeds both the sloth and the moth. All right. The moth here and growing the algae helps to feed the sloth, and it provides its feces and dead in order to grow the algae that helps provide its habitat. So again, there's this weird three-way interaction between the moths and the algae and the sloth. The algae would not grow as well to feed the sloth without the moth. The moth will not grow as well if it didn't live in the sloth fur, also eating and feeding its own algae. And likewise, the sloth wouldn't have nearly as much food if it didn't grow algae and have the moths to help grow more algae. What do you think? Are you going to grow algae in your hair now? Probably not, because I don't want moths. I'd be okay with the algae. I would have a real problem. Did I tell you guys my life story? Oh my gosh. I had these friends that went to Yellowstone this summer, and they had a cabin with a couple other families, and they got home and they were like, we got lice on one of the other families that we spent weeks with in Yellowstone. And we were all like, oh, that's terrible. Like, you hate when having little kids, like, you always get these letters home about what infectious disease is that in your kid's classroom. So the lice one is always one that pops up, and you're just like, I really hope my kid doesn't have lice. And we have to treat them and try to get it out of our house and make sure we don't get it. They all got lice. Both the kids and the parents got lice from being with this family. And they said, you know, we got lice. You need to check your kids for lice. And they were like, oh my, then the family, of course, was like, oh my gosh, our kid has lice. You know, you would think you would recognize this sooner. They went to the doctor with the family that gave them lice, right? They went to the doctor and they said this little girl had probably had lice for 6 months. And they didn't like notice it.
Oh my god.
How would you not notice that your kid had lice for 6 months?
Oh my god.
And again, it's like the classic like host parasite relationship. Like it's really common for mammals to have these types of lice, particularly these types of parasites in your hair. It's something that we have as a society decided that we don't want anymore, and we really kind of work to not have these types of parasites. And then every once in a while, it just. But I was really like, how would you not notice your kid had lice for 6 months? It affected like everybody in your family. Like, they itch, right? Like I can't remember having lice if I had them when I was a kid, but I'm like, dude, don't you notice your kid was like scratching her hair off? Yeah. So that's a host parasite relationship, and there's not really any benefit to us carrying around lice. Okay, and again, these interactions can be incredibly complex and diffuse, especially if we look at these dispersive relationships, and that there can be many species from different phyla of organisms that are involved in dispersing the seeds or pollen of a variety of different species, and that sometimes it's very specialized, as we talked about. There's one pollinator for one particular type of plant species. But in most cases, there's a lot of different interactions that are happening here. One disperser or pollinator can interact with a couple different species of plant. Every species of plant has a few different organisms that it is interacting with. And this is how we build community relationships, and that there is in some cases, a reason for these types of complex relationships, in that specialist relationships come with their pitfalls. If you lose the organism that you are dependent upon, you yourself go extinct, either locally or in a much larger global fashion. And that spreading out these relationships help to buffer and provide resiliency and stability for communities. At the same time that they do that, they incredibly enhance biodiversity. And that by having lots of different interactions between organisms, whether it's competition or predation or symbiosis, we get the biodiversity that we are beginning to really appreciate in terms of conservation biology, as well as resiliency and buffering in these types of ecosystems. All right. Do we have any questions about species interactions before we hit our community discussion? For extra credit on Thursday, you can bring in an example of a symbiosis that we have not talked about. If you want an extra, let's say I'll give you a point on the raw score of your last exam.
Just write it down.
Yeah, write it down. And again, I'll give us the 5 minutes at the start of class and can share with the class. You don't have to have questions. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so we're ready to talk about the last kind of levels of our ecological interactions. We started the semester talking about there are these different ways that we can divide ecosystems. And so we've talked about organisms and populations, and we're ready to talk about communities and the ecosystems that they create in general. And so again, a population is all the individuals of a species that live in a given area. A community then is all the different populations or species that live in a given area. And in ecology, we include in this definition the interactions that they have with one another. But a community tends to be very focused on the biological organisms and interactions. And we tend to think of ecosystems then as going to the next level. And then in an ecosystem, we're considering not just the community of organisms that live there, but also their abiotic environment. And so an ecosystem level, you might see in a given region that there are several different types of communities occurring as temperature or precipitation or soil characteristics vary across the landscape. And again, the easiest way I tend to think about ecosystem ecology is that in my neighborhood, we have suburban lawns, but we also have these freshwater mini streams where all the runoff collects. Okay, and those are two totally different communities that are living in the freshwater ecosystem as well as then on the terrestrial land around them. But we consider it all the same ecosystem of the suburban environment. But there are different communities, and of course then there are these different abiotic factors that determine if you live in the water or on the land. Okay. In describing communities, again, we're talking about the group of species that are in a given area and how they interact. And again, just as with everything we've talked about, you have to decide the area that you're going to be looking at for a community. And again, you can be very narrow in your scope and have a small area. You'll see a certain type of community. The larger you allow your lens to become, the more communities you'll start to notice, the more different types of species you'll start to count, the more interactions you will begin to quantify. But in general, it's always geographically, spatially related as to what a community is. This group of organisms lives and interacts in a given location. We're going to see there's all kinds of interactions that can be very direct, like our feeding and competition and symbiosis, or they can be very indirect, as we're also going to talk about, in that what a predator does to a prey item has an effect not only on what it directly eats, but on what that prey item itself eats, that the predator doesn't eat at all, or ever actually touch or interact with. There are cascades of interactions that happen within communities. And how we define a community can vary tremendously in that some people define a community based upon phylogenetic, taxonomic species composition. We can do that with our forest ecosystem where we have evergreen forest, but in an evergreen forest you can have a cedar forest, or you can have a fir forest, or you can have a jackpine forest. That's a taxonomic phylogenetic definition of different types of communities. Or you can have very functionally based. Again, this is a temperate deciduous forest ecosystem versus the cold evergreen taiga forest ecosystem. You can have an ecosystem that is built around, living around a hot spring versus the nearby grassland ecosystem. And their functions then are going to be very different because they have different species. But the different species then it becomes a question of why. Why do different species occur and have different interactions with each other in different locations? And that is, again, the kind of basis of community ecology is that not only can we just identify, make a list of these species, but why do they occur there in this particular quantity in having these interactions with the organisms around? Okay, all right. So if we're describing a community, the first thing that we do is make a list of the species that are in it. So we did this with our forest ecosystem, and we went out and identified trees. We did this in our prairie grassland ecosystem where we tried to identify all the different plants that were in our given area. We did it to a lesser extent when we collected macroinvertebrates from the freshwater ponds. that we were trying to make a list of the organisms that lived there in order to help us identify and describe that community. Okay, so here we have two different grassland ecosystems. We're looking at the wildflowers that occur there. This is the name of the plant, and then if it occurs in the first community or in the second community, it's given by an X. If it is present. If there's no X, it is absent. So, which of these sites is more diverse, and why would you choose them?
Plot one.
Why?
There's more species.
Good. So species richness, the number of different species, is the first way that we always quantify or describe a community, okay? So that is S, all right? Big S is species richness. And we count the number of different species within a community. It is just presence absence. Did we see it or didn't we? And so in plot 1, it has an S of 10 different species, I think, but in plot 2, there's only 7. And so again, we can see that there's a difference in species richness between these two communities. Beyond just species richness, though, it becomes important how many of each organism is there as well. And so now we can look at the number of each of these species that was present in that community, not just whether or not it was there. So looking at this abundance data now, which community is more diverse? Why?
Because the numbers are more abundant in the few categories and with the very few. There's just seems to be like it's like a lean in one direction. Like there's a lot of blue violet, a lot of yellow violet, a lot of spring beauty, whereas in the other ones they're kind of more evenly numbered.
Okay, that's what I was waiting for you. The other big factor in community composition is not just richness, but what we call species evenness. And evenness tells us something else about the community. It tells us about the relative distribution of each species. And so these two communities are different not only in who's there, but how evenly or equitably individuals are distributed among those different species. And so we would think of this as a less diverse community because there's a whole bunch of just a couple things. And everybody else is really rare. But here you have a lot of all of the things. And so there's more richness potentially when the distribution is more even of individual species. And so when we talk about diversity of the community, we're always looking at these two things, species richness as well as species evenness. Okay. And this evenness is often called relative abundance, and we make these rank abundance curves as a result of this type of data. The species evenness or relative abundance is the proportion each species contributes to the total number of individuals in the community. It's how equitably distributed individuals are across all the different species. And it gives us another sense of the diversity of the ecosystem, and that the true diversity is a combination of these two things, richness as well as relative abundance or species evenness. Okay. The way that we calculate relative abundance, and we're going to do some worksheets probably on Thursday. I don't know, we'll start them today, and definitely your last homework in class is going to ask you to look at some of these different diversity indices. The way that we calculate relative abundance, which is P sub I, is that we take the number of individuals of that species divided by the total number of individuals, capital N, in the community. Okay. And so in this instance, you would total them all up and get capital N, and then you would divide 8 by that total number, and it would give you a proportion, a percentage of that community composed by individuals of wild ginger. And these two communities would have really different percentages of wild ginger in them, and that would give you a different understanding of what was happening in that community. And that was again why when you do these types of surveys, either transect or quadrat based, you not only identify species, but you try to count how many of each one you have. because it's the two factors that give you a complete understanding of the community composition of that particular community. Different abundances will give you different communities. They will underscore that different interspecies interactions are capable and are probably happening. Does this make sense to everybody? Richness versus evenness. I need a little bit of both. Okay. As I mentioned, in terms of species evenness and relative abundance, it's the equitability of the distribution of individuals among the species. We can then start to describe communities as either even or skewed in their species distribution and evenness. And in an even community, you'll have the same or similar numbers of individuals in all the species, like in plot 2 that we've been looking at. This brown community is much more evenly distributed than our orange community. Okay. In an uneven or a skewed community, there are one or a few species that tend to dominate and are very abundant, and everybody else is less abundant. And I mentioned that the way that we begin to look at and visualize community composition is with these types of graphs, which we call rank abundance curves. And we're going to take each species and we're going to count how many there are, and then we're going to graph them most abundant to least abundant. Okay? And you can either do them as dots or you can have little bars for abundance of each different species. But it doesn't matter, you know, this might be red oak in this community and white oak in the brown community. It's just the most abundant goes here. It doesn't have to be the same species. And the slope of the graph gives you an idea of evenness. The more gradual the descent, the longer the tail, the more even the community is. The steeper the slope, the more shorter it is, the less even, the more skewed it is. We're going to see that when we calculate these diversity indices, it's not just species richness, but their relative abundance that plays into the calculation. Okay. All right, so these rank abundance curves, again, the steeper the slope, the less even it is, the more gradual or no slope that it has, the more even it is. In a perfectly even community, this would be a straight line across, so that everybody would have the same relative abundance. Community ecologists often do this in order to compare communities. What's also very interesting is to kind of track the movement of an individual species over and across these rank abundance curves over time or over space. So what might be a rare species in one community might be the most abundant in another. And then you get to ask questions, why? It may be that in wintertime there's low abundance of this species, but it becomes the dominant species in summer. And again, then you can start to ask questions of why does its abundance change? Is it, again, some type of biological interaction, or does it have a physical explanation, an abiotic explanation? Okay, all right. Almost always out of these species evenness discussions and out of the rank abundance curves, then we start to talk about species dominance. We get really interested in that species that's composing most of the community. Okay, so there's several different ways that we can define dominance. But it's usually one or a few species that tend to have either the biggest numbers or the biggest biomass or the biggest impact functionally on a community. In essence, as we're going to talk about these diversity indices, dominance is the opposite of diversity. And that if you have a one or two species that are very dominant, you are almost by definition limiting yourself to less biodiversity because you have these few species that really are dominant. We'll talk about diversity and how to measure it, but again, diversity can be measured in a few different ways, but dominance is going to be kind of the sum of all of our relative abundances squared. And again, if these are very even, then you are going to get a relatively low number, but if you have somebody that's really high, they'll increase and boost this number in terms of dominance. Dominant species tend to be the ones that are determinant for community composition, for structure, for function. We talk about a beech, maple, oak forest community, we're talking about the dominant vegetation that is there. We talk about a chaparral community having certain scrubby bushes there. They are numerically and biomass-wise the dominant vegetation. They determine who else lives there. That makes sense. Okay, so species dominance, it's usually based on abundance. Okay, like what is the most abundant species as we go there and count them numerically. And so in this particular diagram, you can see that numerically the dogwood and the maples are the most abundant species. But sometimes it's important not just to look at numbers, but then relative abundance and biomass, particularly for plants. And that the biomass that is in a tree is very different than what is in a shrub or in a grass, potentially. And so you may have very few individuals of white oak in this particular community, but they form and have the most biomass because there are a few very large oak trees that then dominate and shade out other organisms. The maples and the dogwoods are these tiny little seedlings and kind of scrubby little understory trees. There's a whole bunch of them that have sprung up, but they're all tiny and little stick-like leaves and branches. And so they're not a big portion of what's actually happening in terms of biomass and photosynthesis in these particular ecosystems. If you walk into this forest, you're going to call it an oak forest, even though there are a lot of maples and dogwoods that you're also going to identify. So just keep that in mind as you're considering community composition and dominance, that it's not always just abundance. Sometimes there's something else that's going on there too that can be really important. All right. And lastly, we can think about species dominance in terms of function, which is where we define keystone species. And keystone species are species that have a disproportionate impact on their communities to their relative abundance. And so they have low abundance usually, but they are the thing that defines it as that community. And so the sea otter in the kelp forest is a keystone species. The American alligator in the Everglades and swamps of the southern United States is a keystone species. Because the alligator is there, it creates hollows and swimming troughs and eats other organisms so that other organisms can grow and increase in their abundance in terms of reduced competition among prey items in that ecosystem. When the alligator was removed due to overhunting and habitat destruction, we got this kind of uniform swampland that was very different from the biodiversity of different types of fish and reptiles and amphibians and birds in particular that have been traditionally in the Everglades and these types of swampy, warm ecosystems. The return of the alligator slowly over time as they were protected has then increased and amped up biodiversity by its simple presence there and the way that the interactions it has with other organisms around. Okay, all right. Elephants is a textbook example that you have in our textbook. It turns out that elephants are a keystone species for the African savanna ecosystem. They remove trees. They like to push over trees. They like to eat trees. They like to rub on trees. And in doing so, then they open up the savanna grassland to be a savanna grassland. Without elephants, again, due to overhunting and habitat destruction, you get these woody shrubs and trees that grow up and shade out other types of organisms. And they reduce the diversity of habitat that's present. So again, you can see that grass biomass tends to decrease the more tree canopy cover that we have. And so the less trees, the more grass biomass we will have. And again, we see that the kind of less grass biomass that we have, or I should say the more grass biomass, the more herbivores we have in terms of big antelope, zebras, giraffes that also come into this ecosystem. And we see a similar interference kind of here indirectly between elephants and things like birds. And that as they open up and remove the trees, a whole bunch of different grass and little shrub species come in that then have a whole bunch of different birds that utilize that as a habitat or food resource that weren't there before because the trees were dominating. You can overdo this. Now, in some places in Africa, they have a plague of elephants now because of their protected status. And they have ripped up the ground to the point that not even the grasses grow. So then you can go too far with some of these organisms, again, because they're designed to be occurring in relatively low abundance. It just takes a few elephants in order to do this particular ecosystem job. Okay, cool. All right, we'll pick up with otters as our last one, and then on Thursday we will talk about diversity indices and how we quantify and put together this idea of relative abundance. Okay, take away more food with you if you would like. Please remember that today the introduction